Why don't we start, Randall, with you maybe giving a rough overview of who you are and what you do and why you do it. That might give people a rough idea of who you are initially, and we can bounce from there.
Okay. I've been in ministry for 42 years. I started out in pastoral ministry. I was in that role for 27 years. And, excuse me, now for the last 15 or so, I've traveled internationally, speaking in churches, conferences. I've had the privilege of being in a lot of diverse settings. The thing I think that makes that particularly unique is that in the beginning, I was born and raised in the home, excuse me, in the home of what I would, pardon me, in the home of what I would classify as being a classical Pentecostal pastor. My dad was for almost 40 years.
Wow.
And so I owe a great deal. Pardon me. I owe a great deal to those foundations that were very, very vital in shaping me in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Gave me a deep love and respect for the scripture, and also recognizing the value of the supernatural. And so you said an overview, and it may not sound like it's an overview, but it really is.
Well, you've had lots of overview by the sounds of it, 41 years.
Yeah. And so what happened when my wife and I got married 42 years ago, I had no aspirations to be in the ministry, not at all. I don't think it was entirely because of, me being jaded by growing up in a pastor's home, but a lot of it just had to do with my own sense of inadequacy and my own personal insecurities. And but at any rate, when I did accept the call into ministry, in the very beginning, like most of my peers, I wanted to go along to get along, because in that denominational setting that we were in, it was sort of unspoken, but everybody was aware of it, that in order to find acceptance and affirmation, eventually promotion within that particular system, and I'm not being critical of them, that's just, this was the culture that had developed, and they tended to think that this was the right way, even the only way.
Sure.
And, but probably in previous conversations, Phil, I've pointed out to you that early on in my 20s, I became, even though I didn't describe it in this way, I became aware that I had somewhat of what I would call a nonconformist gene. What I mean by that is that in those early days, in my early 20s, even though I'd been in a very cloistered religious world, I had an insatiable curiosity to grow in understanding, recognizing that what we had been taught over the years, and this was when I refer to as a classical Pentecostal organization. They were birthed in 1886. It's the oldest Pentecostal denomination in the world, and so but I had this insatiable curiosity, and I recognized that, again, that in this very cloistered world, that there were realms of understanding beyond that. And gradually what happened is I began, through, I believe, God's sovereignty and his providence, began to be introduced to other ways of thinking. And so it began to shift my theology. Probably my first introduction was, I was probably 21 years old, and I'm in a bookstore one day, and in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, not so much now probably as it was then, I was constantly reading everything I get my hands on. And my wife used to joke back in those days. She said, he's married to his books. I'm his mistress. And so anyway, yeah.
So when you say you're constantly, you mean like, with the view of learning, of developing, you're not just picking up, the latest kind of novels or things like that. You've got a very driven desire to learn in your reading, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And is that mostly, so, because the thing that fascinates me, because I'm like this as well, and I've always had a nonconformist thing. So when I'm in a bookstore, I look for, what fascinates me is how many people pick up a book and they want to find the next book from their pastor or something like that. And I'm like, that sounds boring, right? I mean, you probably already know all that. I'm like, where's the book that I am going to be like, what the heck is this? Is that kind of when you say you're nonconformist, you're looking for books that you're like, oh, this is totally outside the bubble. This isn't something we talk about, or this is something that's different or new. Was that kind of how you approach these things?
Exactly, because I think even though I was not fully aware of it then, I couldn't articulate it. I realized that my particular tribe studied the Bible to prove what they already knew.
Right.
It was really a pretext that put things out of context. And, it's like the saying, it's not the things that we don't know that give us trouble as much as it is the things that we're certain of that just aren't so. And so, I wouldn't be able to frame it like that 40 years ago. But I've over time come to understand that. And as you've heard me say so many times, ad nauseum probably, that for, when people sometimes ask me, how is it when they come to the understanding of where I started and where I am now in my spiritual formation, they typically ask me the question, how did you get here from there? And my response is always the same. For whatever reason, God chose to give me a greater faith to receive revelation than a fear of being deceived. I just have never really had a fear of being deceived. And so I was in a bookstore one day. I was about 21 years old, and I saw this book that was written by a man I'd never heard of before. His name was E.W. Kenyon. Now, a lot of your audience probably will not be familiar with Kenyon, but Kenyon was a forerunner in his time, because most of what he was talking about concerning revelation knowledge as opposed to natural, or what he would call sense knowledge, those kinds of things, I guess, in that world was dismissed by most people because they wouldn't use this language, but he had wandered off the reservation, so to speak. So I found this book in this bookstore. I came home. I sat on the couch and I read it from cover to cover, and that was the beginning. And fast forward, over the years, what would happen, and I recognized a pattern in this, that I knew that God was responsible for it. I would be introduced to another writer that was certainly beyond our particular, belief system. And maybe you do this as well. I even do this today. If I get a new book, the first thing that I do is I don't read the introduction. I don't read the table of contents. I go to the bibliography in the back, because I want to know who they're thinking.
Yep.
And quite not as much these days, but in the early days, I'd purchase everything that that was in that bibliography, because I wanted to know, or how did you get to where you're at?
Yeah.
And over the years, that's been my quest, because I've not just been, I've never been satisfied. I've had this, and still do, and I hope that I continue to, for the rest of my life, this insatiable curiosity. I came to discover that Jesus, I think that was one of the most attractive things about him. Obviously, the signs and the wonders, the profound teaching, the compassion that he demonstrated, but I think that he represented also a safe place for people that were curious. And you know, I heard an interview that was done about 3 or 4 years ago with a highly esteemed rabbi from some rabbinical school in Manhattan that gave language to a lot of my feelings. He first of all began to talk about the Torah has 70 different faces. When he said that, he had me, because I knew that what he was expressing is that it has at least 70 different perspectives.
Mm.
And he went on to say, and it was quite comical, but really insightful. He said, between two rabbis, there's at least three opinions. Where I had a pause for a moment, at least, was he said, one of the many distinctions between Protestants and people that are Orthodox Jews is that you guys really don't understand the value of argumentation.
Mm.
And he said, we actually see that argumentation is an act of worship. That was, I didn't have any concept. I didn't understand what he meant by that. And then he went on to say that we feel like that when we're engaging in very hearty conversation about a particular topic, that God actually smiles at that, because he sees that we, the two of us, are really in pursuit of truth. Of course, that imagery just summoned all kinds of things to me, even from the Old Testament, for example, and even the language that Jesus used. In the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant had two cherubim that were on the mercy seat, and they faced one another. And God said to them, he said, I will speak to you from between the wings of the cherubim. That whole imagery may seem ancient, but I think it has relevance and contemporary application, in as much as that these are not just replications of angelic creatures, the cherubim. Really, it shows us what happens and how God speaks to us between the faces of two individuals, not just angelic beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No,
absolutely.
I think Jesus was actually referencing that imagery when he said, if there's any two or three that will agree as touching anything, I'm in the midst.
Yeah.
That is imagery that is unmistakably taken from the tabernacle of Moses. This dwelling place of God in the Old Testament in the wilderness wanderings. And there's so much imagery there, from all the pieces of the furniture, but in particular, the cherubim on the mercy seat. And so it almost sounds like when Jesus said, if there's any two or three that agree as touching anything, I'm there in the midst, that he was basically saying, well, if you have two, I would prefer three. In essence, what he was saying, where there are two, I am the third that is in the middle. So I think God really speaks to us in that face-to-face, what we're doing right now, in that face-to-face encounter with one another. He delights in it. This is where he appears. This is where he reveals himself. It really does. And maybe I'm getting too far afield here.
No, it's great. This is good. There's no topic to stick to. So
yeah. And so I really do think he delights in that. That's where he desires to speak. But it does require something that you and I talked about earlier. I think something that is extremely rare, at least from my perspective, not only in the broader culture, but in the church culture in particular, an intelligent humility. And when I, that sounds like an oxymoron, intelligent humility. Wherever you have intelligence, rarely do you have humility. But in particular, it's been my experience in the church culture, you rarely see intelligent humility being demonstrated. And the reason being goes back to what I mentioned that the rabbi said, is that, we come together in a conversation, and a friend of mine recently pointed this out to me, the distinction, and it may sound like he was playing semantic games, the distinction between discussion and dialogue. And at first, when he began to talk about this, I thought, I'm not sure I understand where you're going. Essentially, what is the difference between discussion and dialogue? Well, he went on to say that discussion is a word that is in the same family of the words percussion and concussion. He said, the reason why a lot of discussions are not productive is because it's almost like us beating our heads against one another. It doesn't demonstrate that intelligent humility, whereas dialogue, dia, with, log, is that we are leaning into one another, recognizing that our logic, all of our, our logic is flawed, that none of us is as smart as all of us. That has been the guiding principle for me for a long time. That's why I'm not threatened by things that challenge what I previously believed. I use the example quite often, and this, again, I think is not too far away from what I started out talking about in my particular journey, because, I even have people that consider themselves to be incredibly progressive thinkers that probably have concerns about me now that I'm entertaining heretical ideas. I understand that even that word in the early church had a different connotation than it does now.
Yeah.
Because a friend of mine recently, when I began to talk about, my understanding of the word heresy or heretic, for years, I was hearing, even though no one confronted me personally, that I was getting into heretical ideas. And, it was kind of off-putting and damaging to my self-esteem until I decided to, to revisit the word heretic. And I discovered that it means somebody who thinks differently from the norm. There's that nonconformist gene I was talking about.
That's a badge to wear, right? That.
Yeah. And when I brought that up recently in an interview with a friend of mine who I have great respect for, a real theologian, he interrupted me for a bit. He said, Randall, when you talk about being a heretic, you're not talking about it in the connotation of the early church, those that had deliberately and intentionally tried to undermine the orthodox ideas of patristic theology. I said, no, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I said, when it comes to the Apostles' Creed, there's no negotiation there. This is the fountainhead of truth. This is as close as we can get, to the headwaters of all that we understand to be the kingdom, which would be Jesus. And so anyway, but I did point out, that I really enjoy Seth Godin, who is a real thought leader, of course, in the business community, that said in his last book, I believe it was, about tribes, is that heretics are the new leaders. Yeah. And, it's a matter of semantics. Some people hear that. And when they hear the word heretic, they immediately think of somebody, that is trying to deliberately, in a subversive way, to undermine the things that we consider to be non-negotiable. I don't think that's always the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, it is true, and this is not original to me by any means, but it is true that there was already a narrative that was in place when Jesus began to preach what we call the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was that heretic, right? He was the person that was subversively undermining the narrative that we took to be absolute and true. Right. And some of that is, some of what we hold to be absolutely true is great, and it is absolute and true. But a lot of what we hold to be absolutely true is probably absolutely nonsense. I mean, if we're humble enough to admit, that we're flawed, and we grow and we develop and we grow in a very natural human way, we introduce a lot of rubbish to stuff, So someone subversively going, maybe we shouldn't kill all the Muslims to try and convert them. Maybe there's a better way. That's probably a really great heretic. I'd be very pro that heresy. So absolutely.
One of the most helpful things for me many years ago, I was reading through the book of Acts, and I came to the portion of scripture where Luke describes Apollos and how he meets Aquila and Priscilla, this couple. And they were, people that were of the way, and I love the way Luke describes him. He ascribes some pretty lofty accolades to Apollos when he says that this man was not only mighty in the scripture, but he was eloquent of speech, which you rarely find somebody that has that kind of gift mix. Not only does he have a great command of the topic, in this case, the scripture, but he's also very articulate and eloquent. Yeah. Interesting that when Luke describes him meeting Aquila and Priscilla, that when he met them, he says that they explained to him more perfectly the way. Now, my takeaway from that was that, and this is helpful, I think, to a lot of people that I'm meeting all over the world right now, that is it possible that what you have known in the past is not inaccurate, but very possibly incomplete?
Yeah.
Because what Apollos had known up until that point was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete. So a lot of times, when I'm trying to posture people's thinking, especially when I'm asked, to try to assist the host leader in shifting the thinking of people, I will start out trying to disarm them by saying, how many of you at this very moment in time passionately believe certain things that at one time you didn't? I always get 100% response. Everybody raises their hand. I say, okay, well, there are certain things that you passionately, ardently believe right now that at one time you probably were suspicious that it might be heretical in nature. Oh, yeah. Well, is it possible that as you continue to evolve, as you continue to experience spiritual formation, that you're going to discover that there are other things that are not heretical and that they don't really challenge what you believe to be essential? Now, I know you started out asking me about my journey. So that's sort of where I've been for all these years. And, as you already know, and you're going to continue to find out, because you're about the age of one of my sons, my oldest is 38 years old. It's costly. It really is. But for me, at least, what's happened is that there's so many things that I've read, so many things that I've heard that I can't unsee, I can't unhear. And so I've really sought the Lord for wisdom in navigating the days ahead, because I recognize, as we talked again before we started recording, the importance of transcending and including. Because if what I'm coming to understand in higher levels of consciousness, and that kind of language should not be off-putting to Christians. When people hear that higher levels of consciousness, they immediately think that, that it has such a new agey tone to it, that it's out of bounds. It really doesn't fit with the teachings of the New Testament. It absolutely does. Yeah. Paul talks about the renewing of the mind. He talks about, our not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our. I mean, this is a major theme for him, But if we are transcending or evolving, we know that we genuinely are if it involves including other people, which brings me to the point that I was going to make, because years ago I had a crisis moment in my life where I thought, I am just so far removed from where mainstream Christianity is right now in so many of the things that I believe to be true. Yeah. And so I had a crisis of conscience, I thought, I can't continue to be a part of this. And that's when I felt like I got clear direction from the Lord that it was not an either or situation. And again, I don't mean for this to sound like, I've got this sense of inflated self-importance, but I began to see that the reason why I started out where I described and I've come to where I am is to be a bridge of sorts, because there are people that are on the same path. Yeah. And if I had pulled the plug, if I had said, I'm sorry, I can't, excuse me, I can't continue to relate to you any longer because my beliefs are so different than yours, it would have been a serious error. I
Yeah.
think that's the
Yeah.
reason why we're having this conversation right
Hmm.
now, you and I,
Yeah.
and the many conversations I have throughout the week with
Yeah.
people that are at least beginning to recognize that there are safe zones where, because most of them, it's a matter of life and death almost.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
career suicide for them if they talk openly about really what is happening
Yeah.
in their hearts and minds.
So how did you navigate it? So for me, that's a huge thing. I really struggle with this because, for me, I grew up Christian, moved into ministry, kind of reluctantly dragged a little bit by God into ministry, and was traveling and speaking and doing a lot of what you were doing, itinerant stuff, sharing with leaders, going into their churches and sharing with their communities and helping them and equipping them. But behind the scenes, if I was moving with congregations at a pace of 5, I was behind the scenes moving at a pace of 20. You can grow internally a lot quicker than you can help other people grow. And so I'm outstripping what I'm teaching in a sense, and I'm moving on beyond that. And it left me at this kind of like tension, where I'm like, I'm going into a church and I'm teaching it things that I don't even know if I believe anymore, but it's important for them if they're going to bridge this gap to understand these things. How did you navigate that internally? Like, did you have people around you that you were able to be open with, that you could process with, or did you have to kind of like just go deep in and do that with God, or what did that look like for you?
Well, I have not had more than a handful of people over the years that I've been able to find objectivity, you know,
Mm,
um, to talk to. And when I say a handful, I mean literally a handful.
yeah.
And but there have been seasons where I felt very alone,
Mm,
and I understand the value of that. Um, I think, at least from my experience over the years, that sometimes we need to recognize, while loneliness is not a good thing, it makes you a real target. Um, it is not good that man should be alone,
yeah.
which is not, just a verse that works well in a marriage ceremony. Um, God made us for interaction, to have that whole human experience of interaction with other people. Um, but I do think that there are some times where he has to get you alone in order to form within you, apart from other influences,
Mm,
something that is very unique. I mean, I guess the example that comes to me that is best is in Galatians, when Paul talks about what happened with him when he is sequestered, to the wilderness for all those years.
mm,
And said only for a 2-week period did he come out of seclusion to go up to Jerusalem and to
St.
confer
Peter.
with the apostles. And he made it clear that the reason why, which I find to be stunning, the reason why that he was sequestered for all those years was so that Christ could be fully formed in him.
Mm,
And he even starts out in Galatians, because this is a whole book about law and grace, but he starts out in the opening verses of Galatians. He said, I'm an apostle, not of men or by men, but by the Lord Jesus Christ. It's pretty audacious. He's basically saying, I don't need your affirmation.
yeah.
I don't need you to confirm who I am. And the other thing to me that is just absolutely staggering about that is that, this man, he really had no rivals. I mean, he talks about his resume in Philippians 3. And I mean, not only is he brilliant as it relates to the law, but, to
Mm,
the Greek culture, to his own culture. But to think, you would think that after his conversion, that he's a candidate that is ready, to set the world on fire.
mm,
But God put him in that place where he was alone until the the revelation of Christ was fully formed in him.
yeah.
So yeah, there have been times where I have felt very alone, and I knew that it was the dealings of the Lord. And there have been other times where, you know, it has been a very serendipitous experience where I have met people that have been on the same track that I've been on. Yeah. And it's like a divine nudge where he's saying, okay, you're not alone, get out of your Elijah syndrome. You're the only one. 7,000 have bowed their knee to Baal. Juniperitis, as we used to call it. And which that's really neat. That's maybe a topic for another time. I do believe without question that the people that we connect with in life, that our destinies are running parallel to one another. And that God had determined even before we were ever conceived that there would be points of convergence that would take place out there in our history. I've seen it time and time again. When I use the word coincidence, I don't see it as something as some random event that happens. I see it in a geometric terminology that a coincidence is how two lines perfectly converge. And so I do believe, even this conversation I'm having with you right now, to me, a coincidence is not something that has no rhyme or reason. It's not it really has to do with God revealing to us how he has predestined us. Yeah. And the refreshing thing about it, for me at least, is that when I come to these convergence points that is coincidental, I realize that something is completed in me as well as is completed in the other person. Yeah. Absolutely. We all know in part and see in part,
Yeah. Did you ever feel you were insane? You ever feel like on the journey go, well, what if I actually am completely heretical? What if I am going off the deep end? Because, generally speaking, the nature of being a forerunner or going into some sort of new truth or higher spiritual consciousness, whatever language we use behind that, generally speaking, it's you're the one and the 99 are still left behind. So it can, did you ever go, oh, maybe I'm the one sheep. I'm not I'm the one forerunner. I'm the one sheep and I need to be rescued. Did you ever kind of find yourself in those kind of moments of oh?
Yeah, I did in the early years, not so much now. But I did in the early years. And as I think I mentioned earlier, it comes with a great cost because I'll give you an example. And I'll give you, if you don't let me forget, I'll give you something that for me is my litmus test as to whether or not what I am looking into is truth or heresy. Okay. But before I get to that, there was a guy that I went to high school with. We graduated at the same time. We got married about the same time. We were roommates in college. We started ministry about the same time. Still love him deeply. But he stayed on that particular denominational track. Still is. He's a few months younger than I am. And I remember years ago, I thought, why, we're going along like this, and then, there's this big fork in the road. Why did he stay more traditional and conventional in his thinking, and I went the other way? Well, it's not meant to sound like false humility. I'm not smarter than he is. I think it was because for whatever reason, and he's a wonderful man. He loves God, but he's in a very, very cloistered world, cloistered world. And, he actually is a part of a movement that has lost the ability to, what was a movement that's lost the ability to self-critique. And as a result has become an institution. Yeah. And so I wondered why, and I'm not sure I'll ever get that answer. Maybe it's part of the mystery that we all have to embrace about our journeys. I do believe that over explanation will always rob us of astonishment. And I'm one that, because I'm so analytical, I want answers. I'm learning the importance of mystery now more than ever in my entire life, knowing that having more questions than I have answers is good. Is good. And so anyway, did I feel like I was losing it? And this this may be difficult for some people to, pardon the pun, to wrap their mind around. But in the book of Revelation, which it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, not the Antichrist, which was a discovery I made about 25 years ago that just turned everything upside down for me. Not only eschatologically, but I began to understand that the Bible was not a dispensational book; it was a covenantal book, which changed so much. Yeah. And so, anyway. I understand that what John is referring to, the souls that were under the altar, because this is probably the most symbolic book in all of the Bible. It was sent and signified to his servant John, which signified means to be written in signs and symbols. So there are a lot of people that consider that it had to be written in that way, in a very cryptic way, because of the intense persecution that the first century Christians were experiencing. And that Nero, of course, couldn't decipher the code, so to speak. But when he talks about the souls, those who had been beheaded and their souls were under the altar, I know that he's talking about martyrdom in the first century. There's no question about that. But if you remember the positioning of that, because the scripture has so many different layers of meaning. Going back to the Torah has 70 different faces. Yeah. It has a historical context and value to it, but also has even far more meaning when you look at it in a mystical sense. So I believe that before we can ever ascend into that throne room experience where he sees the scrolls that are, sealed within and without, that are opened, we have to lose our mind. I'm not talking about me being physically beheaded. Yeah. But in many ways, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Before we can ascend to that place that John talks about, where he sees a door that is open in heaven, we have to be beheaded. We have to lose our mind in order to experience the mind of Christ. I think that's really what, when you were earlier talking about, and I don't want to confuse your listeners, but we were talking about spiral dynamics.
Yeah, I was just thinking that's something that we should maybe go into there.
Transcending in consciousness, when you get to that, when you get that highest level of consciousness, the thing that is right above it is actually the mind of Christ. I think that's one of the takeaways, one of the interpretations of how he who was rich became poor for our sakes, that he descended into the lower levels of man's consciousness so that he could ascend and bring us back into the consciousness that was originally ours.
Yeah.
So I told you to remind me, you didn't have to.
Yep. Your litmus test.
Yeah. So my litmus test was this, because this is something that I dealt with internally. And because I wanted, I didn't want to get into something that would cause me to question God's existence, or that was Jesus, was all this a hoax? And so one day I was reading, I guess it's in Matthew's gospel, I think it's chapter 20, and just kind of stumbled onto it, even though I'd read it many, many times. Jesus asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? And obviously, these scholars, quote unquote scholars, were constantly trying to trap him. His response was that you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Upon these hang all the law and the prophets, because the question they had was not about the 10 Commandments, it was about 613 or 614 that he's referencing from the Torah. And so when I read that, I thought, okay, this is my litmus test. If what I am looking into causes me to love God more. Now, and when I say looking into, I'm not just talking, let's take the whole field of theology and put it aside. And let's consider, if I'm making the right application of this, perennial wisdom in general. The wisdom that has come from so many different streams, schools of thought. If these things result in me loving God more, and the sequence here is important, loving God more, loving myself more, and loving other people more, it must be truth.
Mm.
Now, that may be profoundly simple to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I believe that to be true. And I, so it's, so to speak, settled my nerves.
Yeah.
And I don't have this angst about, oh, I don't know whether I ought to read that because it's going down a road, I'm not certain about, whether it be about hell or heaven or the afterlife or who's in, who's out, all these things that are lightning rod issues, obviously, right now in such polarizing times. Because maybe you want to go down this road now. I'm deeply concerned. I mean that sincerely. I'm deeply concerned, especially here in the West, with how it seems like the media right now is more responsible for discipling believers than the message of the kingdom.
What do you mean by that? Go into that a bit.
Well, I'm stating the obvious that here in the U.S., the lines are getting so deep. The divide, the polarization is palpable in nature, and so it's concerning to me when I watch the media, which I think this is probably going to sound like it's conspiratorial, but I think with great intention that they craft a script or a narrative with the sole intention of continuing to dividing and conquering, so to speak. That when I lay down tonight, as we all will this evening for rest, we don't realize that during the night that the system here, as it is around the globe, is creating a narrative, and they determine what we are going to pay attention to tomorrow. That will shape our thinking and our reality. That's the reason I think I maybe got off subject a few minutes earlier. There was already a dominant narrative that was in place when Jesus shows up. This is not a unique perspective to me by any means. And that dominant narrative, that's the reason why when we think the word gospel is rather benign, or that when we hear the word gospel, oh, that's the good news that Jesus saves. But Jesus is actually using a word that was already in play at the time, which was akin to propaganda, because the gospel that was being preached before Jesus began to bring an alternative and even subversive form of wisdom was a gospel that was being advanced by the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
That was, the way that peace is accomplished is through conquering. This whole dividing and conquered, dominating, colonizing, all these ideas. Phil, I wished in some ways, I wished I didn't know these things. Ignorance, I guess, is.
Well, it is, and you see this because the amount of people that are not aware of how media is even filtered to them. So we can maybe look at the really obvious elements of, so as a European, I'm often amazed when I go into America how extreme it is. So I go into America and you literally have news channels that are like, oh yeah, we are right-wing news. And I'm like, what does that mean? News means we're giving you journalistic integrity based facts without a bias, without an agenda for you to filter and think about and understand through your right wing or left wing. Oh no, we're a left wing news. And I'm like, that's not what news means. You can't have right wing and left wing news. Now, everyone, of course, brings a bias to the table on some level, so there is no unbiased element. But the danger to me is that's obvious, and I think it's scary that people don't see it that way. I think there's plenty of people that just watch their news and think it is unbiased news. But what's really scary is I think people that are in other parts of the world look at that and go, oh, wow, that's crazy. Thank God we're not like that. And the danger is that when it's done more subtly, so you look at maybe how social media works, and social media just creates this little bubble around you where it just goes, oh, you're liking that. That's causing you to spend time on our network, buying our ads, or feeding on our ads, serving us money, generating profit. But if you see something that you don't like, you close the page and leave, or you put your phone back in your pocket. Okay, we'll stop giving you those things you don't like that are probably true, or at least a different view that might challenge you to think. So they just shut down all these opposing ideas, different concepts, and you end up in this little bubble, believing bubbled reality on some level. And so I think it's a huge element, and the way that it informs us politically in our day-to-day life and how we do life and raise our family and run our business is scary. But that on a even greater level for me is how it informs us spiritually, how we allow that to affect us spiritually, and we live in these spiritual bubbles in the same way. And I think that's what we've historically, the element of that is, if you look historically at the average person going to church for the last 500 years in a Protestant background, there was no other narrative. If you were part of a Baptist church, the Baptist pastor told you what he learned in a Baptist seminary, and you accepted it as the Baptist truth. But it wasn't the Baptist truth; it was just truth. If you had questions, you didn't have anywhere to go. You could only go to talk to your pastor. You're not going to ask the pastor, "Are you wrong?"
No.
And so we live at least in a new era where we can start asking questions. But I don't think those different pieces of information naturally come to us. I think we have to seek them out. And I think that's why someone like yourself is really important, someone that actively seeks it out and actively tries to present it to people, to create a bridge for people to come across and be exposed to new ideas and new possibilities and a new way of seeing God. I think that's something that we almost have to... aggressive is probably the wrong term, but aggressively go out there and make happen, because it doesn't naturally happen for people. I don't think that's the way we're built. Our systems.
No, I don't either. And we talked about this again before we started recording, is that I'm also, not only am I concerned about the degree to which the media is discipling the church here in the West, but I'm also equally concerned about a lot of very clear clarion voices that are addressing very important issues as it relates to racism and social justice and all of the things that we should be concerned about as kingdom people.
Yeah.
But I think the propensity is, and I'm seeing it happen, and I'm not trying, I say I'm not trying to be critical. I guess they probably will assume that I am, about the tone of it. Because, I get that these topics need to be addressed. But when to me, it's becoming toxic because, I'll put it to you this way. The quickest way to become a Pharisee is become good at identifying one.
So true.
And so, it's the spirit of what we have to say. Yeah. So if you're calling out all these injustices, you're talking about white supremacy and racism and social justice. Hey, I'm with you. You're exactly right. But be careful what spirit you're of, because you're going to become guilty of the same thing, that you're calling them out on. And that's a razor's edge. I get that. And I also know that, as again, off recording, there are people that are more than likely going to say, oh, okay, if you don't stand for something, you're going to fall for anything, which, they've come too late to play that card with me, because I am seeing in my own personal experience, in a microcosm, I am seeing how this works. And I have genuine, healthy conversation and connection with people that are on the far right, as well as I do with people on the far left.
Yeah.
And I think probably one of the reasons why I'm seeing some success in that is because I'm not trying to convert either one. You
Yeah.
know, they probably sense or recognize, they discern that I'm not interested necessarily in arguing about how wrong they are, because
Yeah.
a man who is convinced against his will is of the same opinion still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
And but if they sense that you love them where they are,
Yeah.
you know, to me, that's like I was talking to a group of people some time back, and they're championing these causes for people being transformed, and I'll just leave it at that, as vague as possible. And I pointed out to them, I said, do you realize that genuine transformation begins with accepting people where they
Yeah.
are, rather than saying, you need to change, you need to come over here.
Mm-hmm.
you know um, if people sense that they are accepted where they are, who they are,
Yeah.
regardless of their condition, regardless of their belief system, regardless of their human condition, then that to me is what activates transformation. And that transformation probably won't look like what I think it's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's interesting you talk about it, because at the end of the day, if our metric is, do I love God? Do I love myself? Do I love others? I think you cannot love the person in front of you until you understand them. You can't. You can do your best, but at the end of the day, I need to understand your story, who you are, where you're coming from, what your pain is, what your hurt is, what your passions are. When I understand these things, I can love you more effectively. You just need to look at your relationship with your partner, right? You talk to your partner, and until you kind of get what makes them tick, you're going to try and love them and really piss them off potentially, right?
Yeah.
So you need to understand. You need to know where they're coming from. And I think the issue is, until we understand, we're just fighting with an enemy, because we conflate the issue, which maybe is toxic and awful. It could be some very toxic Christian belief. It could be a very political thing. It could be a social thing. Whatever it is that is bad, that is wrong, that is anti-kingdom, that is anti-love, anti-goodness, that needs to be killed. It really does. It needs to die. But until I understand you and how you have become embroiled in that, I'm going to conflate the two, and you are my problem. And I think that's the danger is, for me, I totally agree with you. Like, I'm often seen as not, I'm seen as too left for the right and too right for the left. And I go, oh, I don't even like this idea that there's people on right and lefts,
Right.
But the reason for that is I probably have my own preferences and my own leanings, and they probably do lean more in one way than another. And I probably do, at least before I speak, think, oh my gosh, what an idiot. Or, we all have our moments. But on the whole, my number one goal is, how can I understand you? How can I understand where you're at, right, so that we can have a conversation? And you look at this in practical terms. I talk to people on a political level, and I was just in the South on a trip throughout Georgia and where was I? Louisiana and Georgia. And I was talking with some groups of people that have gone through radical change. And you talk to them and you go, oh, so tell me, why do you believe what you believe politically? Because me coming from Europe, when America talks about right and left, as a European, your left is still pretty central, if not right. Yeah. So we live in these totally different bubbles and worlds. So for me, I'm like, oh, I want to understand, because it's very easy for me to look at a right, central, or left position in America and think, whoa, that's extreme. It's still all very extremist to where we are, in the same way that most Americans look to Europeans and go, oh my gosh, these guys are extreme crazy. They're communists, Mm-hmm. And it's sitting down with a person going, why do you think the way you think? Why do you, one of the examples is, one of the guys I was talking to he was like, oh, you guys are crazy socialists. He's like, socialism is deeply evil, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, all right, let me stop and ask a few questions. And he's like, yeah, okay. And I was like, if you had someone on your street day in, day out who was starving, and it would cost you pretty much nothing to make sure they could eat, would you feed them? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, okay. And I'm like, okay, so immediately That's something that from the European crazy, left perspective that I might have, I'm looking at people that are poo-pooing socialism, and I'm thinking, oh, they don't care about someone that's poor and homeless, hungry. Oh no, they do. And I said, oh, if you had someone that had broke their leg and you could get them in a car, drive them to a hospital and make sure they were healed, and it didn't cost you inordinate amounts, it didn't affect your family negatively, would you do it? And yeah, of course, I'm not a crazy, deranged animal. And I'm thinking, oh, that's funny, because that's how a lot of Europeans do see America's policy on healthcare, or,
Right.
And it's when we start asking questions and going, oh, we're humanizing one another, and we're realizing we actually both love people. We both want the best for people. We both want to care for people. None of us want to see people starving. None of us want to see people dying on the streets. None of us want to see a war happening, maybe with a few extremes here or there. It humanizes and it opens up a discussion. And immediately this person, when we start talking about this, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Can I tell you how I've perceived this conversation, how I've perceived the way that some of these policies look? Or can I tell you how it works in Europe a little bit? He's immediately like, yeah, please tell me more about that. I'm really interested. Just me asking and me opening up to going, do you want to hear some of my perspective? He's immediately open to it, because I've asked him more of his perspective. I'm opening up to, what is your perspective? How can I understand where you're coming from? And it's opened up my heart to love him more. If I'm honest, I probably was more sheltered or more conservative in my offering of a real open, vulnerable love towards that person, because I was being defensive, because I don't know what this person thinks. If they're pro, I don't know, the death penalty, I don't know how generous they'll be to me if I say I'm not. I don't know. Because someone is pro-death penalty, are they violent? Are they pro-death? Are they pro-killing people? I don't know. It is extreme thoughts, but they lurk in the back of our heads when we're talking about people that have radical different thoughts. So anyway, sorry, a bit of a ramble, but
no.
These dualistic ways of seeing, I guess that's my point, is we become so dualistic, and we just blanket statement, like categorize entire groups. Oh, you're Pentecostal? Oh, so you believe this. Well, that might work for your friend that hasn't deviated much, but it certainly doesn't work for you.
No.
And so, but until I have a conversation with you, you're in that group, whether you like it or not. And that's just so unhelpful.
Yeah, I think it was, are you familiar with Parker Palmer?
I don't think so,
Parker
no.
Palmer.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, he's a great Catholic thinker. That's not the best way to describe him, but he's written a number of books. I think it was Parker that said that the only real honest question is one that doesn't already have an answer.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, because most of us don't realize that the questions that we ask, we already have determined the answer that we're wanting.
They're so loaded. Yeah.
And that's not an honest question. It's like the lawyer that came to Jesus, when he tells the story of the Samaritan, and he asked the question because he was wanting to defend himself. He wanted a certain answer. And so, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying loud and clear. This whole thing of labeling and, right and left, insiders, outsiders, that, the fear of the concept of inclusion. I wonder if they're reading the same New Testament, and so much of this, and this is not just something that is unique to the West. So much of this is just ego driven, when you come back to dualism, dualistic thinking. And, I love the writings of Cynthia Bourgeault and Thomas Merton on the false self and the real self. Been so enlightening to me, and becoming more aware of my own egoic operating system, so to speak. That the ego has this this need to want to categorize, label, quantify everything and everyone. And why? The answer is very simple, because this is what continues to perpetuate my sense of superiority or uniqueness. And, Bourgeois is brilliant at bringing a balance to it and talking about how that there are certain things about this that are essential initially in our formation. Father Richard Rohr is brilliant at it too, and to have life and falling upward. They're not, maybe this is not the best metaphor. They're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. They understand that this is essential as human beings to our formation in the beginning, but eventually we have to become aware that my identity is not that I am white, or Caucasian, that I'm a male, that I'm a father and a husband, all those kinds of things. That's not the core of my identity, because if I allow that, to be the filter through which I perceive my world around me, it is going to lead to this dualistic thinking. It is going to cause me, I taught some time ago about the myth of separation, going all the way back to the origin, the seedbed of it in the Genesis narrative, and how that has been perpetuated, all the way to where we are now. And you see that the pathology of that in the scripture. Truly, it is a myth, that this myth of separation. I still, I by no means mastered it. I become more and more aware of it in instances where I feel either appalled by somebody's behavior, or I find myself offended by their belief systems or whatever. And in those instances, I'm reminded I'm not separate from them. Does that make sense?
It's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And what intrigues me about it is, when we look at the evolution of humanity as culture, I'm not saying, people have to believe in evolution or not, but just as we've grown as humans, we can see this this forking between the East and the West, and Eastern philosophy, Eastern religions, and then our kind of Western Neoplatonic kind of perspectives and how that shaped our religion, which is Christianity. What's interesting to me is the Eastern religions seemed to, if they were going to hone in on anything, it was the ego. It was trying to rein in this ego, trying to see something beyond themselves, maybe seeing the other as even them on some level. It's I'm loving my neighbor as myself. That's a very it's very in line with a lot of Eastern religions. What intrigues me is how that seems to be very much at the core of Jesus's message, loving your neighbor as yourself. But he's literally saying, if you want to love God, go love that person over there. When you love that person, you're literally loving God. It's not as if you're loving God. It's not pretend you're loving God so you love them well. Or you are literally, when you love that person, God's going to go, oh, thank you for loving me. So there's this that's a core thing of Jesus, for sure. It's there.
Absolutely.
And yet we seem to have almost gone the other way. It feels like Christianity is so egoic in its baseline. It's so me, and it's so about developing our ego. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's something I think about a lot, about how we seem to have drifted from that core message to such a degree.
Well, a couple of things. There's a very, almost a sound bite. I think it's maybe in the Gospel of John. I don't remember the address right now, where Jesus said something that I think when those who heard it the first time, the disciples, it was a bit of a conundrum for them. He said, if you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose it, you'll discover it. Interesting, isn't it? And, we have reduced that to, some salvation pitch, I don't want to get off topic here, but, I point out sometimes that people with sincerity often described to me their conversion experience as when they invited Jesus into their life.
Mm.
And when I hear that, I wonder if that doesn't need some adjustment to understand that you didn't invite him into your life. He invited you into his, which was a selfless, altruistic experience. And the question in the psychological community and sociological community, is it possible for any human to do anything that is totally altruistic, that doesn't have a motive behind it? Back to what I was saying, I think that what Jesus was addressing there when he uses the word life, if I'm not mistaken, it traces back, the etymology of the word traces back to the Greek word psyche, from which we get psychology, which is wrapped up in our ego, our persona, what we believe ourselves to be. And most of us live our entire lives in totally an unconscious state of not understanding that we're not who we think we are. We're not who other people think we are, but we think we are. We really do. And so I think that really is part of the whole journey that we're on as humans, is to somehow recover, to discover who we really were before we had a face. Not just our consciousness, but the consciousness that he had of us before our conception. Now it may be sounding a little mystical. I don't know. But Paul makes it clear in Ephesians that we were chosen in him before the foundation of the world, that we are not the product of our parents' passion. I put it this way, my mother's womb was a dressing room for me to manifest out of eternity into time. And then when I came into this material world, there were all these things that began to shape my identity that might not have had anything to do originally with his idea or his image of me. Okay. So, yeah, this whole thing, and I deal with it every day. I don't always deal with it very well. I'm thankful that at least I'm beginning to learn it now. For many years, I would become very discouraged as to, why didn't I learn this earlier? Why didn't I get this in my 20s? Why didn't I get this in my 30s or whatever? But it's like the old proverb, when the student's ready, the teacher will appear. So now I'm learning to be thankful for, oh, thank God, I'm beginning to make these discoveries. And, and this may be something that some of your listeners would take issue with. That's okay. That, the prefix re, which means to go back, right? I think I had it in my notes at one time. I think it's used about 300 or 400 times in the scripture. So is it possible when the Lord says to return, to remember, to be restored, to revive, all of these prefixes, is it possible that it actually has to do, or remembering, it has to do not just with something that is confined to my own memory, but the consciousness that he had of me before I ever was conscious of him? That's Jeremiah, when he is expressing his sense of inadequacy, when he's tapped, to become a prophet, and he has all these excuses as to why he's not worthy. And, God speaks to him. He says, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you. So I think the whole human experience, the whole journey, is to discover what he knew about me before I knew anything. I really think, why did God introduce himself to us to begin with? Why did he do that? I put it this way: God introduced himself to us so that he could introduce us to the person he knew us to be before we became the person we think we are.
Wow. I like that a lot.
So that's losing your life so that you
Yeah.
can find it.
Yeah.
That comes back to, am I insane? Am I losing my mind? Yeah. That's the souls under the altar in the Revelation.
Mm.
Because I think the whole thing, when John is given that invitation in chapter 4, I grew up in a tradition that taught that's unquestionably a text that proves the evacuation, or what they would call the rapture of the church. I heard a voice that said, "Come up here." And I think that really has to do with how that he transcended to a higher level of consciousness, that the door was open, for him to come up into that realm and to see things from an entirely different dimension, from a heavenly dimension. I think that's what it means for heaven to come to earth.
Yeah. So you said that, you've not got this down, so don't worry, I'm not going to hold you to laying out the perfect framework for anything. But, you do say you're wrestling with this, you're trying to figure it out, you're trying to, navigate, how do I let go of this life that I may gain it? How do I kill the ego so I may ascend, whatever that looks like? What does that look like for you? What are some of the practices or things that you've experimented with that have helped you in that practically, like day in, day out?
Well, as soon as you said that, I thought about the statement that Paul said, "I die daily." I die daily. And it is daily. I feel like I'm making progress if even a couple of days out of the week I become acutely aware that, okay, I'm dying a little more that I might truly live. I'm dying a little more to that false self. Obviously, you mentioned earlier about evolving, as opposed, and I tell people that I do believe in evolution. I'm not a Darwinian, but I do believe in evolution. And if you read in that New Testament, the teachings of Jesus, or even the Apostle Paul, it's another word, but they teach evolution. You're changing. Physically speaking, I've been changing while I've been talking to you. My body is changing. When I get up off this couch, I'm going to leave my DNA behind. You have to see it with a microscope, but it's here. I'm changing. My body's changing. My mind is changing. And so I may not be answering your question as satisfactorily, but I think I have to take joy even in incremental changes to this whole thing of recognizing the distinction between my false self and my true self. Because it can get incredibly discouraging, because we have a way, most of us forget what we should remember and remember what we should forget. And so for me, I think it comes through cultivating, being aware of that, and as much as I possibly can, cultivating a more contemplative lifestyle. Understanding that knowing God, the well-known soundbite from Psalm 46, to know God means that you have to be still. You have to come into that place that what Rohr calls deep time. Learning how to be fully present. Tolle was right when he wrote about the power of now. Because as the Trappist monks talked about, maybe they got it from the Buddhists, the monkey mind, is constantly reminding us, chattering away, yeah, and it makes it almost impossible to be fully present. So I'm caught between my past and my future, and I don't realize that that real transformation has to happen in the moment,
Mm.
in the moment.
Yeah.
And as much as technology is a great blessing, it's equally a curse. And as much as
Yeah.
it's made us almost totally impossible
Yeah.
for us to be fully present.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I always say to people, I'm like, we all think we can be present to some degree. I think we're self-aware enough to say we can't be fully. But I'm like, if you go and sit in a room on your own with nothing, no technology, no people, nothing,
Yeah.
you'll go insane in minutes. In minutes, if you're lucky. A lot of us in seconds are like, oh yeah, I don't have my phone, or like we're
Yep.
reaching for something to distract us from being present with
Yep.
ourselves, just being here. And I'm fascinated by that element. That's something that I constantly working on. I host a book group here in our home every couple of weeks, and we just started doing Rob Bell's How to Be Here, which of course is heavily influenced by Ram Dass's Be Here Now and all these kind of principles that ultimately all stem very much from a lot of Eastern philosophical and religious kind of concepts of being present.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was something I was so conscious of when I started to realize, I need to have a little bit of death to self. And I just need to stop so wrapped up in this world that constantly thinks of what's happening next, or constantly is reliving the past, regretting the past, thinking I'm so great for the past, whatever it was, just living in those highlight reels of the terrible moments, and then constantly paranoid about the future, constantly excited for the future, but never once actually just being present in the moment and just being happy to be here, just to experience life, to take a breath in and experience the joy that is when you can just take a breath and enjoy it for what it is. Step out on a nice day and you breathe in that fresh air after it's just had some rain or something, and you just go, oh, it's just beautiful. And I miss it every day, every second of every day. I miss it on the whole.
And most of this stuff is really hidden in plain sight, so to speak. I have believed this for a long, long time, that, and I think it was St. Francis that coined this phrase, that God's original language was creation. So what does that mean? That means before man took his first breath, before he even began to develop this thing called language to describe what he was seeing, that before he made an audible sound, that silence existed before sound. And that in the Paul brilliantly and concisely says in Romans 1 that the invisible things of God are clearly seen from the creation, being understood by the things that are made. You get this knee-jerk response from a lot of people, especially some of the latest books that have come out, that say, "Oh, that's pantheism." I like, what was it, Rohr said, that it's not pantheism, it's panentheism, that everything is not God, but God is in everything, which brings us back to that whole thing that, the myth of separation, dualistic thinking, that we're not separate from one another. We're not. That's the reason why the planet is suffering right now, is because we have not stewarded it. We've not treated it like a garden.
Yeah.
We've not tended it like the progenitors of the human race were commissioned to do.
Yeah.
And I certainly admire the passion of those that are bringing that to our attention.
Yeah,
I think,
absolutely.
I mean, so another thing that I believe that a lot of that is accomplished, the death of the ego, by being fully present in a moment, by recognizing. And I'm the world's worst for it, because my mind is always going.
Me too.
I've read for years that you have between 60 and 70,000 different thoughts in the course of a day. I probably have 120,000. And but to be fully present with whoever I'm with, not trying to formulate a response to what it is they're saying. To when I'm out in creation, to recognize the wonder of it all, and to know that it's so easy to lose the wonder. Things as simple as, and I don't get it right that often, but at least I'm making progress, practicing gratitude, simple gratitude, you know, realizing not just what I have in creature comforts, but the experiences I've had in meeting people.
Yeah.
You and I talked about before we started recording, some of the people that we've had the privilege of meeting, being in their presence. And not so much being enamored with them, but being just so engaged with the image of God in them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. The moment, the words, I often think of the word namaste. It makes me, I love it. The whole, the divine in me, or the light in me, recognizes the divine in you, or the light in you. And you can look at that from the New Agey, kind of like all the different perspectives and poo-poo it or whatever. But I think that ultimately it's that same thing. It's Christ in me recognizing Christ in you. And I think, how often in my day when I'm talking to my wife, do I genuinely believe that this is some divinely created, magnificent, extraordinary person I have the privilege of just being in the presence of, you know? Or that might be easier depending on how great your wife is. For me, it's wonderful. It's nice and easy, maybe. And I maybe do it 3 times a day if I'm lucky. But what about the teller in the grocery store? What about the homeless bum that you walk past? You know, to what degree am I able to be present and look at that person and go, oh my gosh, that's God. On some level, on a metaphysical, hard to grasp, completely, maybe on some level beyond our comprehension, that's Jesus Christ in the flesh. That is God in the flesh. If we're to take the words of Jesus literally, which I quite like to do on the whole, maybe less than what is symbolic, but you know, I'm like, there's nothing more present than in that moment. There's nothing more present than, and I think to me, it's actually easier to do that with the creation, right? So maybe looking at the panentheism kind of thing of like, it's very easy for me to look at creation as sunrise and go, oh my gosh, I'm witnessing God, something divine right now in the sunrise. Or I watch a David Attenborough documentary and I'm like, whoa, you know, it's like, this is cool. This is amazing. There's something profound about that. But it's, on some level, it's actually harder when it's the people I rub shoulders with every day. It's the people even the people I look up to, never mind the people I look down on. It's a whole nother level of, for some reason it's more removed. I don't know if that's the way that we see our humanity, if that's the way we're quite Gnostic in that sense. It becomes much more fleshy and tangible, and it removes itself from the spirituality and the divineness of God, of the ultimate creation. I don't know what that is, but it's definitely something that I war with in myself, of like, oh man, I'm not recognizing the divine in people around me. And what would it look like if I did, right? Because in the few seconds I do sometimes, you know, that changes everything. The occasional time I see a homeless person and go, oh my gosh, that's God. So maybe I should pull over and not drive right past them without thinking. Maybe I should see if they need some food, or if I can pick them up in a hostel tonight or something. Practically, you can't do that to every person you try. You know, I'm not saying you have to, but it definitely changes things immediately.
I resonate so much with what you're talking about. I think probably for me, as I mentioned, that, you know, I don't get it right that often. But I think the first steps toward experiencing transformation is recognizing the need for it. You know, I would hate to go through life and not even be aware of any of the things that we're talking about. You know, and it may be an extreme word, but, you know, just living in completely narcissistic existence. So I try not to obsess over how seldom I get it right, you know, and be thankful that I even know this, that I'm aware of this. And that's something that I think is a very important conversation these days, and maybe has been treated more like a peripheral issue when it's really one of the most important,
Mm.
as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's so good. I think, yeah, it's having grace for yourself as well, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, like you're saying, you can beat yourself up for not getting it right very often, but that takes all the time anyway, right? So now you're spending all your opportunities to be present, just living in the past, beating yourself up for being rubbish at it. Or you could go, okay, well, let's move on, and I can be present right now. I can step out of that. But it's recognizing that actually it's the warring, it's the fighting, it's in the act of fighting to be present that I actually lose the ability to be present. It's this in the fighting to lose my ego is such an egotistical thing, almost, and so we find actually it's in this like striving that we actually are losing our capacity to do it anyway. You have to let go. You have to hold this thing lightly. You have to go, of course I've not got it right very often. I got it right never before that though. So, here's to tomorrow where I get it right a little bit more, maybe 5 times tomorrow. I'll recognize it in the 10,000 seconds or however many seconds in a day.
The learning curve is steep, isn't it?
It is. But and I think it's recognizing again, like we were saying earlier, about God meeting us where we are, and God going, oh gosh, you think it's about being present every second of every day? No. It's about the journey of learning to be present. That is just as much a joy to God as us getting to that place where we can be present in every second of every day. It's not about the getting it right. And if it was, we would have got it right a long time ago as humanity. Jesus would have left us in a lot better place if it was all about getting everything absolutely right.
Maybe growth is more about getting it wrong than it is getting it right. It's being in constant need of mercy every day.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Because I think that's true. I think our whole concept of holiness, it means to be set apart, of course. It means totally other than. But when we think about God's holiness, especially those of us that have been raised in traditions like mine, it almost has a connotation of unapproachable. And I think that's a mistake. I think really the path to holiness, if it means to be set apart, totally other than, which that in many ways describes God, be ye holy as your Father in heaven is holy, or be ye therefore perfect. I don't think that is an over the top demand that he's making of us as much as it is an invitation for us to experience it and to return to wholeness. Pardon the play on words, but I think that's really more about what holiness is about. It's about returning to wholeness. And that wholeness is not just for me personally, but the wholeness that exists between me and the rest of humanity. That's what dispels the whole dualistic thinking. I live with this myth of separation that I'm different than you, but I'm not. And you never connect more with God and his holiness and your own personal wholeness until you become aware of that.
Yeah. So as someone that works a lot with churches, with church leaders and stuff that has a desire to move people beyond this dualism, I can't see many institutions that are more dualistic than certainly the Western church. It's certainly the main institutions within the Western Church seem to be extraordinarily dualistic. Very us, we're in, you're out. Not even of the world and us, but even like, the Baptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Charismatics, we, even amongst ourselves, we're so dualistic. How do you see this changing? How do you see it breaking down? Like, do you have like a battle plan of like how you go about doing this? Or do you think that there's a trajectory that the church needs to be going on for it to change? Or do you think something has to happen outside of that? I'm talking about asking questions that aren't loaded. I'm unloading all my questions for this meeting to see, like, is there anything to any of this?
Well, I think that any change that is sustainable has to be systemic in nature. It's not like you can inject an entire population with these ideas and suddenly, it is in their system, so to speak. It's more systemic. It's something that has to come up through the root system of who people are. When I use the word systemic, as soon as you ask that question, the first thing that came to mind is what Jesus talked about when he described, the 7 parables in the 13th chapter of Matthew of what the kingdom of God is like. The 7 distinct parables that he uses there to describe what the kingdom of God was like, there's one common denominator between all of them. And that is that all 7 of them have to do with something that is concealed. It's not obvious. A net being cast into the sea. He talks about, in particular, the kingdom of God is like a woman who hid leaven in meal. So, interesting application, because leaven had been consistently used as a type of something that was sin, and he uses it as a positive metaphor. And so, the essential characteristics of leaven is that leaven is certainly small. It's almost infinitesimal compared to what it's introduced to, and it's silent. But over time, it affects everything that it's introduced to. So I believe, for me at least, that the way that, you begin to see the change that we all desire to see take place is that we recognize that it's introduced that way. It might be something that we think, well, we're not having as big an impact as we ought to, because we've been conditioned to think that it's the loud and the audacious that brings change. That was just not the methodology of Jesus, was it?
Yeah.
And
that's so true.
And so our tendency to think is if it's not loud, if it's not just in your face, that you're going to go unnoticed. And I think that's a mistake. I believe that there's probably far more positive change that is taking place than most of us are even aware of.
Yeah.
Because the information is controlled that we get. We don't really know. We think because we live in a information age where everything is real time, and that we've got our fingers, so to speak, on the pulse of what's happening. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that there is something that is happening that I'm very encouraged about that may not be as obvious. Maybe, I guess some people think that's a utopian perspective, but I really believe it is true. And I think that's how all sustainable change takes place. Yeah. As I said, it's systemic in nature. It's something that comes up through the root system over time.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. So I 100% agree. I think it requires this deeper change to happen. One of the things that I found when I was in Georgia, I was talking with all sorts of different people. In fact, in Louisiana, I was talking to some people, and I was fascinated talking to these guys that early 20s and they're in university, and there's a group of 4 or 5 of them doing their master's degrees, you know, so very, you know, young, progressive, educated. They were doing arts degrees, you know, English and history and things. So I'm like, wow, these must be very progressive people. And one of the girls says to me, I just broke up with my partner. And so I was asking about that, and she said, well, basically what it was is we were going out for a year, and he just wouldn't introduce me to his parents. And even when he was introducing me to his friends or talking about me to his friends, he would always say, oh, my friend. He would always call me his friend, and he would refuse to introduce me to his parents. And eventually it came to a point, and I was like, what is going on? What is the deal? It's been a year. And it turned out it's because she is of Indian heritage. So she has brown skin. And I'm like, hold on. So, because to me, I don't know if I live in a bubble. I certainly, we all live in bubbles, but maybe me being in the UK or, you know, in Europe or whatever, or my subset in the UK of my progressive ideology or whatever. But I'm like, hold on. So it's 2020 and we've got maybe a 22, 23-year-old doing a master's degree who's embarrassed to be dating someone of a different race. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is huge. But what's fascinating is that is the end of that conversation for me, where or of that issue, in a sense, where if we ask how does that change, how do we move forward from this? If you just go down maybe 6-7 years to people that are 15, 16 years old, and I met a bunch of young teenage or like mid-teenagers, and was asking them like, what is the culture like in your high schools? You know, like these are conservative Christians in their family upbringing and things like that. But I'm like, where are you at? What do you believe? Like, what do your peers believe? There's not one of them that has any concept of like furthering certainly any explicit racism. Maybe some implicit racism is there. It always is in all of us. But they're like, oh no, like, are you kidding? But these are people that were raised by the internet. They aren't raised by their culture. Mm-hmm. They're raised by an exposure that is beyond them. So they can be in a rural town in Georgia, but it's the people in the cities, New York, San Fran, you know, Seattle, London, Paris, Sydney, you know, these are the people that are exposing them to how the world should work, what the world should look like. And for years, we in the church have gone, oh, this is the evil agenda of the world to, you know, water us down and make us, you know, non-Christian or down our good Christian values. And there's maybe some elements of that can happen, of course, that it can change us negatively. But when I look at the next generation, I think, oh my gosh, there is some serious systemic change where talking to these kids even about what bullying looks like. And they go, oh my gosh, yeah, bullies, like they are the least cool people in school. And I'm like, oh, that is not my experience of school. When I went to school, it was the cool kids that bullied everyone, and you were uncool because you were, you know, getting bullied. And now it's like, oh no, well, we know, like, being kind, being compassionate, showing empathy to someone that's weak or disabled, or, you know, has ginger hair or is shorter or whatever ridiculous thing that, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we were getting bullied over something like that. Now it's like, oh no, the coolest kid is the kid that's comfortable in themselves and loves people and looks after. And I'm like, this is a crazy systemic change. Mm-hmm. And my work with youth here in the UK, I've worked with youth for many years. I've seen that develop, but I was fascinated to go into a rural place where a lot of those things are not systemically driven in the overall culture, but to find that it doesn't matter because these kids are being raised by YouTube, by TikTok, by Instagram, by whatever, Netflix. And yeah, their education is a certain bubble and their families are a certain bubble, their churches are a certain bubble, but they live outside of that. And I think it's a really exciting time where, to me, we live in the new Reformation, where the reason the Reformation hit wasn't because Luther was particularly charismatic. It was because he had a printing press. You know, I mean, if we break it down to why it worked then, why then, people were asking questions before then. They just were silently killed and moved on before anyone else really found out. Luther could, you know, send out flyers and leaflets everywhere and start publicizing things. And other people could write and come off his ideas and publicize more books and literature to share. And how much more so today, where you don't have to go and hunt out a library and know what kind of terms to look up to try and find out about a heresy or something that you might be entertaining. Your pastor can say, by the way, this is the way it is. You're going to burn forever in eternal conscious torment, and that's the way the Bible says it. And you can type in, eternal conscious torment, is it true, into Google, and immediately you've got 300 different views. And the next generation, maybe my generation, certainly your generation, will be less inclined to quickly jump on their phone and do that. But the next generation, you can't get away with any bullshit. You can't get away with any black and white dualisms, because they'll type that dualism into Google and find out very quickly it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so I get really excited about the possibility of that. But I don't know how much the system, you talked earlier about institutions and movements that we mentioned briefly, and I think we talked about it earlier as well, but maybe it might be interesting to talk a bit about that. But I think that's a movement that I don't know if the institution of church as it operates on the whole in the West, if it's ready for that kind of mass information, mass questioning, and mass exploration. I just don't know if church is ready to sustain that or to hold it up. I don't know if it's got the wineskin for that wine. Do you have any thoughts on that, maybe?
Well, no, I would agree with you. But I am encouraged. On the larger scale, you're right. I don't think that they have. There's far too much intolerance for that kind of thing. But I am encouraged in meeting with people, so to speak, off the record, that are not. At first I thought that I was going to be on a very lonely journey because I'm of the baby boomer generation. I was born in 1958, and but I have been just really encouraged in discovering that there are people even my age and older that have been on the. I mean, think about how egotistical that was. I thought I was probably one of the only few. Millennials, of course, are more inclined because of what you just described. They're going to fact check you.
Yeah.
And their discernment is very underrated by people of my generation. Something else, you talk about these subsets that I think is really unfortunate and could potentially sabotage the whole prophecy of Malachi of turning the hearts of fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, which I think is an important and essential prophetic characteristic that any of us that have the privilege of being called fathers should be aware of. But the thing that I was going to say is that so many people of my generation have, referred to millennials in a very condescending way, that they have a sense of entitlement. They don't have any work ethic. The derogatory label of, I don't know whether you've heard it in Europe, but they're snowflakes. That really grates on me, because they assume that all millennials, and most millennials don't even like to be referred to as such, but most 30-somethings, they're not one size fits all any more than people of my generation.
Yeah.
We're not all created equal.
No, absolutely.
And so the reason why I mentioned the whole thing about fathers and sons, and it's not gender specific, of course. I understand that there have been many abuses and misuses of that principle as well that have created cultures of control and codependency. And there's a lot of people that definitely have an aversion for that for obvious and understandable reasons. The fact remains is that I think that there's an emerging generation, in particular the millennials, that really are not defiant. They're not in their questioning, in their fact checking. It is not meant to be defiant. Yeah. Actually, they have many core values that we should admire. Most people in my generation are not aware of them. They're not as materialistic as we were. I'm finding that out in my limited reading is that, they don't have the same aspirations of what we would refer to as it relates to the American dream.
Mm.
A house and a white picket fence and a 401k, a retirement fund, all that kind of stuff. They, for the most part, want to make a difference. Well, how admirable is that?
Yeah, it's a beautiful.
Yeah, and that's why they're concerned about all these things that most of us in my generation dismiss and say, well, climate change is a hoax, or all this uproar about social justice. It's all this is just a diversion, and that's creating an unnecessary divide. Would come maybe in some ways full circle to what I want to what we were talking about earlier, is that I don't want to do that. I want to be a bridge, and I want to be able to, for them to feel like that they can safely, without reprisal, they can call me out. I shouldn't. I'm not saying I get this right all the time, like I mentioned earlier, but I shouldn't have such a sensitive ego that if somebody younger than somebody young enough to be, one of my sons, my natural sons, call me out on something, that I should get offended by that. I could say, okay, all right, maybe I was wrong. Help me, because it's not. It's reciprocal in nature. The misunderstanding, the gap that is created is because of all the things, the prejudices that we have and the stereotypes that we have, my generation, concerning that age group. And so the assumption is that you need to learn from me. I can't learn from you. But it's a reciprocal, thing. And, and I think, at least, maybe I don't have a clear perspective on it, but I think that there are people that are, your age, that are looking for that. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I feel like I'm this fountainhead of wisdom. I have learned some things. Do I believe that you need to listen to some of the things I have to say? Yeah, but that doesn't mean that, all wisdom is proprietary. It's like, no,
absolutely.
The man whose name is synonymous with wisdom is Solomon. And he wasn't an old man when he got the download. He was 20, 21 years old.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. So, yeah, I am encouraged, even with all of the vitriolic language that you hear these days that's coming through our media, because, and what you just described, I think probably some of it had to do with where you were geographically, the Deep South.
Absolutely. I mean, I travel a lot through a lot of other parts of America, and I see it to different degrees in different ways and different things. So I'm very aware. When I was with them, I was like, I realize I'm in like a bubble, like big time. But do you guys realize you're in a bubble?
No, they don't.
But yeah, so it's sort of, I mean, I'm going to New England next, on the 8th next month, and totally different world. Right through kind of, I'm going to be based in like Nashua, but like up through Massachusetts, Vermont, maybe northern New York. So a few different areas, New Hampshire.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well,
but it's a different world, and so I think it just shows again, we to the degree we open up to something that's different, right? And like, it's craziness to think, well, to me, it seems crazy to me that I can look at someone that's gone, oh, wow, you've had almost 30 years more experience than me in life. Of course, you've got stuff to teach me. But the humility on the flip side for me to look at someone that's 10 years my junior, 15, 20 years my junior, look at a 10-year-old and go, you probably could teach me some stuff right now, because you've got a perspective on life that is so different to me. I remember when I was in Georgia, talking to some of these 15-year-olds, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you actually are less dualistic than I am. Like, is it on any level possible that there's kids growing up that are already transcending dualism? I feel like privileged that I have the concept that I may one day transcend some dualism occasionally for a few minutes here or there, 10 years from now. That's where I feel I am on the journey. And I talk to people younger than me and I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. Like they're going to get it. They're going to be living in that. By the time they're 30, 40, there's going to be a whole generation of people that are on the whole. And again, you can't pigeonhole everyone in a generation to one thing, but on the whole, people are growing up realizing, oh, this dualism thing is kind of crazy. It's not how it works at all. Even just looking at teenagers and how they engage with their parents now, I'm like, oh my gosh, if I had engaged my parents like that, I would have grown up much wiser, much more well set for the rest of my life, and my parents and my relationship with them would have been better. And you just look at that. And again, there's people who have terrible relationships with their parents. Of course, there's always that dynamic. But again, on the whole, things are moving in this direction. And I think it's the thing of the loudest voice gets the news piece, right? If it bleeds, it leads. If it's bad news, we stick it on the front page. If it's people yelling, we'll get a soundbite from them way more than we'll get a soundbite from the wise, wizened person sitting back going, well, maybe it's this, we're not going to listen to that guy. Give us the guy that's screaming in someone's face. We'll get a 10-second clip from that. That's much better. And I think that does rob us a little of, I think, seeing what's happening behind the scenes, like what you're saying, that there is an amazing amount of good happening behind the scenes.
Well, and that, like I said, that some people may think that that's overly optimistic, but I do believe that in the end, that love wins. I do believe that the kingdom of God is going to advance. And I'm even careful about my use of that term, the kingdom of God, because when I say the kingdom of God, what that means to some people is entirely different than what I mean. But I really do believe what Victor Hugo said, that he said the invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an idea whose time has come. It's true, and that kind of, I think, reflects what Jesus said again about the kingdom of God is like a woman who hid leaven in meal, and it eventually affects it all. So the revolution, when we hear the word revolution, I think we tend to think of it like you just described. It's something that's almost militant in nature, that it is audacious and a takeover and that kind of thing. But let's look at the revolution of love that Jesus introduced, and how it came about. Going back to that whole thing that we mentioned earlier, in Mark's gospel, and he says, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a totally different spin on the word that it was already in play in the dominant narrative. And it was, in essence, what he taught was a subversive form of wisdom that was more subversive and alternative to the time, that would have been considered not only by the empire, but also by conventional religion of the time as being propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's totally counter to everything that was in play when he showed up, and but the way he went about it,
it's beautiful, isn't it? Absolutely beautiful. And I think that is what will save this world. We mentioned sound earlier, but it's this beauty will save the world. This love, this grace, this compassion. No one can see that and not go, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. You can't look upon one person loving another and go, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful thing. Someone feeding the homeless, someone taking an orphan into their home, someone giving a widow a hug because they've just lost their loved one. Like, you can't look at that and not be broken yourself. You can't look upon that and not be moved yourself. And we can look at someone screaming their head off on the news or on a televangelist, TV channel or whatever. We look at that all day and not be moved sometimes. Sometimes it moves me in a very negative way. But you can't look upon these acts of love and compassion and empathy and grace and kindness and mercy and not be moved in a profound way. And I think that's what moves humanity forwards, and that has moved. I mean, anyone that's done any form of history lesson, it doesn't take much to see the radical transformation in the last 2,000 years. While Christianity has screwed up on monumental levels a lot of the time, the world is better for Christianity. There is no question. And this message of Jesus, as much as it was co-opted in many ways, it's still come through a lot. And so you can talk about the evils of the empire, but there were plenty of people in the empire loving. And you can talk about the evils of this institutional religion, but there's plenty of people within it that are transforming the world and loving their neighbor. Absolutely. I think there's so much good to be seen.
Yeah, that's the reason why that, I think I mentioned earlier that it doesn't have to be an either or thing. If you have what I believe is part of my assignment to be a bridge. And so, I understand where people are coming from when they become very critical of the conventional or traditional church. I get it. And I certainly want to extend grace to people that feel like that they had to leave the current expression of the church in order to find God. But here's the one qualifier on that. That doesn't mean that all of the conventional church or traditional church is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Or should be, totally dismissed as being irrelevant and not up to speed with, what is really important today. Because, you were there one time. I was
Absolutely.
there. I still am.
Absolutely.
And, at the point of being redundant, if I have transcended to any degree, I should include them too.
Yeah.
100%. It's by the grace of God that you are who you are and know what you know.
Yeah.
That alone, or you would be, I don't know what your background was, but let's say that you grew up Anglican. Well, Phil, you could still be back there.
Yeah.
And
in a sense, I still am there. There's definitely a whole host of my makeup is where I came from. There's no way to escape that, and you can run from it. But the person that's running from it is the person that it created. And if you hadn't been through that terrible situation, you wouldn't be the amazing person you are today, right? If we can see it so black and white. The example I often give is if we look at something like spiral dynamics or sort of Ken Wilber's kind of like levels of consciousness and stuff, is there was an interesting experiment done where they basically looked at how people influence prisoners. And so they looked at people that were in prison who, generally speaking, on the whole, if you deal with broad sweeping statements, people who are in prisons are generally at that kind of warrior spiral dynamic stage reds. It's very much, it's very egotistical. It's very, I wanted something, I take something, it's, I want that, I'll steal it. I want that, I'll rape it. I want that, I don't like that, I'll kill it. It's that kind of level. Now, not everyone in prison is there either. And so that's far too broad a stroke. There's plenty of people in prison, especially in America, for not much of anything, it seems. But what's fascinating is they looked at the different types of organizations that tried to influence those prisoners and then what happened to those prisoners. And they looked at like really conservative, evangelical, black and white thinking Christians. And then they looked at like very progressive, very liberal, very hippie, whatever languages you would give to these kind of other types of churches. And they said, well, which ones are actually influencing these prisoners? And when they come out, which ones are seeing the most positive change? Well, what's fascinating to me is if I look at this as a progressive thing, or maybe I'm a bit more left-leaning or whatever, and I go, well, obviously this model would work better because it's more evolved or more enlightened or more progressive or whatever. It's not true at all. The ones that most affected prisoners in a positive way, that transformed their lives, that lowered reoffend rates, that enabled them to go back into workforce and into communities and better their community for being there, and they got stuck into church, the evangelical conservative churches. And it's because people at that level need some black and white structure, some rules, some stability.
Right.
And so I often use that example to be, you might be in a different place. You might look back upon where you've been and gone, oh yeah, I'm not there anymore. And it's rubbish. It's not good. Well, maybe for you now, it's not helpful. maybe for you now, you can see it as toxic. But actually, at some point, it was probably really formative for you and really important in shaping certain elements of you.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to remember that there are people that are a step before that still need that to exist for them to ever have the chance of growing to where you are. Because what we often think is it's like, imagine a progressive liberal person who wants to save the whales going into southern Sudan and trying to talk, what's his name? Coney, the guy that's, has child soldiers and he's killing everyone and he's like, got kids in the mines and he's like mutilating women and stuff. And they go into this place and they go, hey, listen, Joseph, we'd really like to talk to you about stop using single-use plastics because it's getting thrown in the ocean and it's causing a lot of problems and the whales are dying. We know what would happen, right? They'd be dead in about a millisecond, But this, I think, is sometimes what we're trying to do is as we transform and as we change and as we move on from one stage of life to another or one expression of Christianity to another or whatever that looks like, we demonize another stage, but actually forget that's probably one of the most important stages for a whole group of people. If any group of people is ever going to influence somewhere that's in those like very militant states of life, it probably is the evangelical conservative churches. Those are the churches that are exploding in Africa because Africa's coming out of a lot of that, of those stages of how they've operated their cultures. And so they need to move into that. They can't, it's like talking China into stop, abusing the planet to grow and develop. And it's like, well, they didn't get an industrial revolution. We did. It's kind of unfair for us to be like, well, you don't get to have one. It's probably a good idea for us to figure out how can we speed that up and get you through it so you don't, kill us all. But of course they're doing that. We did it. There was just less of us then, so it was less of an issue.
Right.
There was 1 billion of us on the planet at the time when we were doing it, so it wasn't a big issue. Now there's just 1 billion of them. Never mind the rest of us.
I think that's a great comparison, and the direction I want to go in. Not just demanding that people come to where I am before I can have, interaction with them. Well, dude, I'm gonna have to go.
Yeah, we need to wrap up. So let me finish by saying thank you so much, obviously. But how can people connect with you? If people want to try and speak to you or follow you, you're on Instagram? I know. What's your Instagram name? Is it just Randall Worley?
It's the let's see. I'll have to because I don't manage that account.
I noticed
the Randall Worley.
It is the Randall Worley. Okay, cool. I'm going to put this stuff at the bottom of the show notes so people can connect with you. What's your website? Is that randallworley.com?
Yeah, randallworley.com.
Cool.
Is all the need for that. And
awesome.
That's what it is. The Randall Worley.
Awesome. And are you still traveling, or is there ways people can connect or see you speak or hear your materials?
Our schedule is usually updated on the website. On the website. And quite often, we make people aware of it on Instagram. We're more on Instagram than we are on other forms of social media. I haven't been on Twitter in a long time.
Me neither.
Yeah.
I feel bad about it. Every now and again, I'm like, I prayed maybe I should, but yeah, whatever.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you for coming on. Honestly, it's been a privilege. I appreciate you giving us so much of your time. And we'll have to catch up again for sure.
Buddy.
Yeah. All right. Love you, man. Catch you later. Yeah.